What if I told you that the exhaustion you call normal, the anxiety you call personal failure, and the injustice you are told to endure quietly are not accidents of life, but the deliberate products of a system that feeds on your labor while denying your humanity? What if the very world presented to you as inevitable is, in truth, a historical construction designed to benefit a few and discipline the many? You wake each day to sell your time, your strength, your creativity, not because it fulfills you, but because survival demands it. This is presented as freedom. You are told you choose your work, choose your suffering, choose your poverty. Yet what kind of choice is made under threat of hunger, homelessness, and social exclusion? This is not freedom, it is coercion disguised as consent. Capital does not rule by chains alone, it rules by shaping consciousness, by making exploitation feel ordinary, by turning oppression into routine. The unbearable nature of everyday life is not rooted in human weakness. It is rooted in the organization of society itself. Capitalism does not exist to meet human needs, it exists to expand capital. Profit, not life, is its organizing principle. Under this system, human labor becomes a commodity bought at the lowest possible price and extracted for the highest possible return. The worker creates wealth but owns nothing. The worker produces abundance but lives in scarcity. This contradiction is not a flaw, it is the engine of the system. Look around you. Productivity rises, yet wages stagnate. Technology advances, yet leisure disappears. Wealth accumulates, yet insecurity spreads. The ruling class celebrates growth while the working class bears its cost. This is surplus value extracted from living labor, concentrated into private hands, and reinvested to tighten domination further. Capital grows not by creating, but by appropriating, by turning the collective effort of society into private power. And to maintain this order, ideology is deployed as forcefully as any police baton. You are told the market is neutral, competition is natural, inequality is deserved. You are taught to see success as virtue and poverty as moral failure. You are encouraged to compete with one another, worker against worker, nation against nation, so that you never recognize your shared condition. Division is not incidental, it is essential. A fragmented working class is a powerless one. Yet beneath this manufactured normality lies a growing rupture. People feel it in their bodies and minds, the endless work that leads nowhere, the debt that never disappears, the sense that life is slipping away while profits soar elsewhere. This discomfort is not confusion, it is awareness beginning to form. It is the lived experience of contradiction between what society promises and what it delivers. History teaches us that no mode of production is eternal. Feudalism once declared itself ordained by God. Capitalism now declares itself the end of history. But systems fall when the conditions they create become intolerable to those who sustain them. The working class is not merely a victim of history, it is its driving force. When workers recognize themselves as a class, when they understand that their struggles are collective rather than individual, the foundations of domination begin to crack. Do not be deceived into thinking your suffering is isolated. The same system that exhausts the factory worker degrades the office worker, dispossesses the farmer, and disciplines the unemployed. Different forms, same relation, labor subordinated to capital. Your power does not lie in individual escape, but in collective action. Rights were never gifted from above. They were wrested from below through organization, solidarity, and struggle. The ruling class fears nothing more than conscious, united workers. That is why education is commodified, unions are attacked, and dissent is criminalized. That is why you are told politics is futile and changes unrealistic. But every gain the working class has ever made was once deemed impossible. The 8-hour day, the right to organize, social protections all were achieved by those who refused to accept the unbearable as normal. The task before you is not merely to demand reforms within a system built on exploitation, but to question the system itself. To ask why a society capable of producing abundance condemns millions to precarity. To imagine a social order where production serves human needs, not private profit, where labor is a means of self-realization, not survival, where the wealth created by all is owned and controlled by all. This requires more than anger, it requires consciousness. More than hope, it requires organization. More than critique, it requires action. The working class must see itself as a historical subject, capable of transforming the conditions of its existence. The chains that bind you are real, but so is your collective strength. The unbearable feeling you carry each day is not a sign of defeat. It is the pressure of history demanding change. The question is not whether the system will be challenged, but whether those who suffer under it will recognize their power in time. Rise not as isolated individuals, but as a class. Organize not for survival alone, but for emancipation. The world you are told to endure is not the world you must accept. What is called normal is not the natural rhythm of human life, but the carefully engineered outcome of a social order built on exploitation. The routines people accept as inevitable, the long hours, the constant insecurity, the quiet anxiety about survival, did not arise from human nature or universal necessity. They were produced historically, shaped by material conditions and enforced through economic power. Capitalism presents its arrangements as timeless truths, but they are neither eternal nor neutral. They are social relations designed to extract value from labor, while disguising that extraction as common sense. From the moment individuals enter social life, they are trained to see work as an obligation rather than a collective activity, wages as fair compensation rather than partial repayment, and inequality as the result of effort rather than structure. This training does not require constant violence. It operates through habit, culture, and repetition. When exploitation is made routine, it no longer appears as exploitation. It becomes the background noise of existence. People do not ask why they must sell most of their waking hours simply to exist, because this demand has been normalized to the point of invisibility. The so-called normal workday is a clear example. Human beings create far more value than they receive in return, yet this imbalance is treated as reasonable. The worker is paid enough to survive, not enough to reflect the true worth of their labor. The excess is appropriated by those who own the means of production, not because they contribute more, but because property relations grant them power. This arrangement is defended as natural efficiency, even though it depends entirely on historical dispossession and enforced dependency. Without access to land, tools, or resources, the worker has no real choice but to submit. What appears as voluntary exchange is therefore structured coercion. The worker is free only in the sense that they are free to starve if they refuse to comply. This is not freedom in any meaningful sense, yet it is celebrated as the highest achievement of modern society. Capitalism redefines freedom to mean participation in the market under unequal conditions, while stripping it of any connection to dignity, security, or collective control over life. By narrowing the definition of freedom, the system protects itself from moral scrutiny. Normality also depends on fragmentation. Workers are separated by profession, identity, nationality, and status, encouraged to see one another as competitors rather than allies. This division prevents recognition of shared exploitation. When suffering is individualized, it appears as personal failure rather than social design. Debt becomes shame. Unemployment becomes guilt. Exhaustion becomes weakness. The system thrives on this misrecognition because a population that blames itself will not challenge the structures that oppress it. Even suffering is disciplined into acceptable forms. People are permitted to complain about stress or fatigue, but not to question why these conditions exist. They are encouraged to seek personal solutions, self-improvement, resilience, motivation, rather than collective change. This turns systemic violence into a psychological problem and political anger into private despair. In this way, capitalism colonizes not only labor but thought itself, shaping how people interpret their own pain. The idea of normality also hides the historical violence that created current conditions. The accumulation of capital required enclosure, colonization, slavery, and the destruction of communal forms of life. These origins are erased, replaced with myths of innovation and merit. By severing the present from its past, exploitation is made to seem like an outcome of progress rather than its foundation. What was imposed through force is remembered as evolution, yet the feeling that something is wrong persists. Normality is experienced as unbearable precisely because it contradicts human potential. People sense that life could be organized differently, that abundance should mean security rather than anxiety, that collective labor should produce collective benefit. This tension between lived reality and latent possibility generates discomfort that ideology cannot fully suppress. The system demands acceptance, but the body and mind register the cost. When exploitation is called normal, resistance is framed as extremism. Any demand for structural change is labeled unrealistic or dangerous, while the daily harm inflicted by the system is treated as reasonable. This inversion protects power by making injustice appear moderate and justice appear radical. But history shows that what is presented as normal today was once imposed against resistance and will one day be recognized as intolerable. Normality under capitalism is not a reflection of human needs or social harmony. It is the stabilized form of domination, maintained through habit, ideology, and material dependence. To recognize this is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is the first break in the spell that makes exploitation feel inevitable, the moment when people begin to see that what surrounds them was made by human hands and can therefore be unmade by human action, when the ordinary routines of obedience start to appear as what they truly are. Not the natural order of things, but a fragile arrangement, sustained only as long as those who endure it believe it must remain. So capitalism transforms human labor from a living, creative activity into a commodity to be bought, sold, and consumed, severing the worker from the very essence of their humanity. Labor, which should be an expression of human purpose and social cooperation, is reduced to a measurable unit of time exchanged for wages. This reduction strips work of meaning and converts the worker into an appendage of production, valued only insofar as they generate profit. What is exchanged in the labor market is not merely effort, but life itself, parceled into hours and surrendered under conditions the worker does not control. In this system, the worker does not own the tools they use, the product they create, or the process by which they work. All of these belong to capital. The result is alienation at multiple levels. The worker becomes alienated from the product of their labor, which confronts them as something external and hostile, owned and sold by another. What the worker produces does not return to them as fulfillment or security, but as profit for someone else, and, often as commodities they must repurchase to survive. The more the worker produces, the poorer they become in relation to the wealth they create. The labor process itself is also alienating. Work is organized not according to human rhythm or collective need, but according to efficiency, discipline, and control. Tasks are fragmented, standardized, and monitored, depriving workers of autonomy and creativity. The mind is separated from the hand, planning from execution, thought from action. This division is not accidental. It is necessary for capital to dominate labor. By breaking work into repetitive motions, the system ensures replaceability, weakening the worker's bargaining power and reinforcing dependence. Alienation extends beyond the workplace into the worker's relationship with themselves. When survival depends on selling labor power, identity becomes tied to employment. Worth is measured by productivity, usefulness, and income. Those who cannot sell their labor due to illness, age, or economic crisis are treated as burns rather than human beings. The worker internalizes the logic of the market, judging themselves by standards imposed from above. Even rest becomes instrumental, valued only as recovery for further exploitation. Social relations are also reshaped by this commodification. Under capitalism, relationships between people appear as relationships between things. Wages, prices, contracts, and profits obscure the underlying human interactions that produce them. Cooperation is masked as competition, and solidarity is undermined by the constant pressure to outperform others. Workers are pitted against one another for jobs, promotions, and security, fracturing collective identity and reinforcing isolation. This isolation is not a personal condition but a structural one, embedded in the organization of production. The commodity form does not stop at material goods. It extends to time, attention, emotion, and even personality. Workers are expected to perform enthusiasm, flexibility, and obedience as part of their labor power. Emotional labor is demanded without acknowledgement, while burnout is treated as an individual failing rather than a systemic outcome. The boundary between work and life dissolves as capital seeks to extract value from every moment, turning existence itself into a resource. This alienation is often obscured by the ideology of choice. Workers are told they freely choose their jobs and therefore bear responsibility for their conditions. Yet, this choice exists within strict limits set by property relations and economic necessity. The freedom to choose between exploitative options is presented as genuine freedom, while the lack of alternatives is ignored. The worker's dependence on wages is portrayed as independence, masking the reality of subordination. Technology, rather than liberating labor, frequently intensifies alienation under capitalist control. Machines are introduced not to reduce working hours or ease human effort, but to increase productivity and profit. Workers find themselves competing with machines or being managed by them, their labor further abstracted and devalued. The knowledge embedded in technology is owned by capital, not shared collectively, reinforcing hierarchy rather than diminishing it. Despite its totalizing reach, alienation is not absolute. The very discomfort workers feel the sense of emptiness, exhaustion, and disconnection is evidence that human needs exceed the narrow confines imposed by capital. This discomfort reveals the contradiction between what labor could be and what it has been made into. Human beings are social, creative, and cooperative by nature, yet they are forced into relations that deny these qualities. The persistence of dissatisfaction signals that the commodification of labor is an imposed condition, not an inherent one, sustained only through economic pressure and ideological reinforcement, reproduced daily through wage relations that continue to separate the worker from their product, their activity, their fellow humans, and themselves. Ideology functions as the invisible architecture of domination, shaping how people interpret their world while concealing the forces that govern their lives. It does not operate primarily through lies but through selective truths, framing coercive social relations as natural expressions of freedom. Under capitalism, individuals are told they are free because they can choose where to work, what to buy, and how to live, yet these choices exist within rigid boundaries defined by property, wealth, and power. Freedom is reduced to market participation, stripped of any connection to control over the conditions of life itself. The coercion embedded in wage labor is thus rendered invisible. Workers are compelled to sell their labor power to survive, but this compulsion is reframed as voluntary exchange. The absence of viable alternatives is ignored, and necessity is mistaken for choice. When survival depends on submission to market logic, consent becomes a fiction. Ideology sustains this fiction by celebrating individual autonomy, while refusing to examine the structural constraints that make autonomy impossible for the majority. The worker appears free because the chains are economic rather than physical. This same ideological machinery transforms division into competition, presenting rivalry as both natural and desirable. Workers are encouraged to see one another as obstacles to personal advancement rather than as allies in a shared struggle. Competition is portrayed as a measure of merit, masking how outcomes are predetermined by unequal access to resources, education, and security. By framing inequality as the result of effort, ideology erases the role of class structure and legitimizes domination as fairness. Competition also serves to atomize the working class. When individuals are locked in constant rivalry, collective identity dissolves. Solidarity is replaced by suspicion, cooperation by self-interest. This fragmentation weakens resistance, as people who see themselves as competitors cannot organize effectively against a common source of exploitation. Ideology reinforces this isolation by promoting narratives of self-reliance and personal responsibility, suggesting that success or failure rests solely on individual character rather than collective conditions. Even suffering is individualized through ideological framing. Poverty becomes a lack of ambition, unemployment a lack of skill, exhaustion a failure of resilience. Structural violence is translated into personal deficiency. This not only absolves the system of responsibility but also disciplines those who suffer within it. Shame replaces anger and guilt replaces critique. People internalize their oppression, policing themselves more effectively than any external authority could. The concept of freedom itself is redefined to serve power. Freedom is no longer the ability to collectively determine social priorities, but the ability to navigate markets as isolated individuals. Political freedom is narrowed to formal rights detached from material reality. The right to vote coexists with economic powerlessness, and this contradiction is normalized. Ideology insists that political equality compensates for economic inequality, even as wealth translates directly into influence, access, and control. Division is further intensified through identity fragmentation, where differences among the oppressed are emphasized without addressing the underlying economic relations that produce shared exploitation. While differences are real and meaningful, ideology weaponizes them by detaching them from class structure. Struggles are pitted against one another, creating false hierarchies of suffering and preventing unified resistance. The system benefits when anger is dispersed rather than directed at its source. Education, media, and culture reproduce these ideological patterns daily. Stories of individual success are elevated as proof of fairness, while collective struggle is marginalized or criminalized. Historical victories achieved through mass organization are rewritten as the result of enlightened leaders or market evolution. In this way, ideology not only explains the present but reshapes memory, ensuring that alternatives appear unthinkable. Yet ideology is never complete. It must constantly be reinforced because lived experience contradicts it. People feel the pressure of coercion despite being told they are free. They sense isolation despite being told competition brings progress. These contradictions generate cracks in the ideological structure, moments where the reality of exploitation becomes visible. When workers recognize that their struggles are not individual but shared, the spell begins to weaken. The power of ideology lies in its ability to make domination appear reasonable and resistance appear irrational. By disguising coercion as freedom and division as competition, it stabilizes an unequal system without constant force. But ideology depends on belief, and belief can be challenged. As material conditions worsen and contradictions sharpen, the narratives that once sustained acceptance lose credibility. What was framed as opportunity begins to feel like confinement. What was sold as freedom begins to resemble control. And what was praised as competition reveals itself as a mechanism that keeps the many divided while the few remain united in their command over labor, resources, and social life. Collective class consciousness is the true source of working class power, because without it, workers exist only as isolated individuals navigating a system designed to dominate them. Capital confronts workers not as a scattered collection of people, but as a unified force, organized through ownership, institutions, and the state. When labor remains fragmented, it is easily managed, disciplined, and replaced. Only when workers recognize themselves as a class, bound together by shared conditions and shared exploitation, does the balance of power begin to shift. Class consciousness is not an abstract idea, but a material awakening rooted in lived experience. Under capitalism, workers are encouraged to understand their struggles as personal rather than collective. Low wages are framed as individual shortcomings, unemployment as lack of effort, exhaustion as poor discipline. This framing prevents workers from seeing the common structure that shapes all their lives. Class consciousness breaks this illusion by revealing that what appears as individual failure is in fact systemic design. When workers recognize that millions share the same insecurity, the same precarity, and the same lack of control over their labor, isolation gives way to solidarity. This awareness transforms how workers understand power. Individually, a worker has little leverage against capital. Collectively, workers produce all value in society. Nothing moves, nothing is built, nothing is maintained without labor. Capital depends entirely on this collective activity, yet it works tirelessly to conceal the dependence. Class consciousness exposes this contradiction. It reveals that the ruling class does not create wealth but appropriates it, and that workers, by withdrawing or reorganizing their labor, possess immense social power. Class consciousness also redefines identity. Instead of identifying primarily through occupation, status, or competition, workers begin to see themselves as part of a broader social force. This does not erase differences, but situates them within a shared economic relation. A factory worker, a delivery driver, a teacher, and an office clerk may perform different tasks, but they are united by their lack of ownership over the means of production and their dependence on wages. This shared position becomes the basis for unity, enabling coordinated action rather than fragmented resistance. Without class consciousness, resistance remains spontaneous and easily contained. Protests flare up and fade away, anger is expressed but not organized, reforms are granted and then rolled back. Consciousness gives struggle direction. It connects immediate grievances to long-term goals and individual demands to collective strategy. Through organization, education, and shared analysis, workers move from reacting to exploitation toward actively challenging its foundations. The ruling class understands this danger well. That is why it invests so heavily in suppressing class consciousness. Unions are weakened, radical education is marginalized, and historical memory is distorted. Workers are taught that collective action is outdated or unrealistic, that solidarity is naive, and that change must come from individual success rather than collective struggle. This ideological assault aims to keep workers locked in the present, unable to imagine themselves as agents of history. Yet class consciousness does not emerge from theory alone. It arises through struggle. When workers organize, strike, and resist, they learn through practice that their power lies in unity. Each collective action teaches lessons that no abstract argument can replace. Victories, even small ones, demonstrate the effectiveness of solidarity. Defeats, when analyzed collectively, deepen understanding rather than producing despair. Through struggle, consciousness becomes material force. Class consciousness also expands the horizon of possibility. It allows workers to see beyond reforms within capitalism toward the transformation of society itself. When workers understand that exploitation is not accidental but structural, they begin to question the legitimacy of a system that prioritizes profit over life. This questioning opens space for imagining new forms of production, ownership, and social organization based on collective control and human need. The power of the working class does not reside in moral appeals or isolated acts of resistance, but in its ability to act as a unified social force. Class consciousness is the condition that makes this unity possible. It turns numbers into power, suffering into struggle, and shared experience into collective purpose. As this consciousness spreads, the foundations of domination weaken, because a class that understands its position can no longer be ruled in the same way. A class that recognizes itself as the producer of all wealth begins to demand control over that wealth, and a class that sees history as something made by human action starts to recognize that it has the capacity to remake society itself. Social transformation begins when the unbearable is no longer accepted, because tolerance is the quiet partner of domination. Every system of exploitation relies not only on force but on endurance, on the daily decision of millions to adapt rather than resist. What people are trained to endure becomes the boundary of what power can impose. When suffering is normalized, it ceases to appear as injustice and instead becomes background noise, something to be managed privately rather than confronted collectively. The unbearable does not announce itself as a breaking point. It is slowly incorporated into routine, into habit, into the expectations people place upon themselves. Capitalism depends on this accommodation. It stretches working hours, intensifies labor, and deepens insecurity gradually, ensuring that each new burden feels like a minor adjustment rather than a fundamental violation. People are told to be grateful they are employed at all, grateful for wages that barely sustain them, grateful for survival presented as opportunity. In this way, deprivation is reframed as realism, and resistance is portrayed as immaturity. The system survives by lowering expectations until exploitation feels reasonable. The unbearable becomes truly dangerous to power only when it is named as such. The moment people stop interpreting exhaustion, anxiety, and precarity as personal misfortune and begin to recognize them as structural conditions, endurance turns into refusal. This shift does not happen overnight. It grows from shared experience, from repeated contradictions between what is promised and what is lived. When hard work no longer leads to stability, when loyalty no longer offers security, when sacrifice benefits only those who already possess wealth, the legitimacy of the system begins to erode. Acceptance is not passive. It is actively produced. Education teaches obedience disguised as discipline. Media promotes coping over change. Culture celebrates resilience while avoiding the question of why resilience is required in the first place. People are encouraged to adapt endlessly, to optimize themselves for conditions they did not choose and cannot control. This adaptation is praised as strength, yet it serves power by preventing collective confrontation. As long as people believe they must endure, transformation remains impossible. History shows that major social changes occur not when conditions are at their worst, but when people decide they have endured enough. Slavery did not end because it was cruel, but because enslaved people and their allies refused to accept cruelty as destiny. Feudalism did not collapse because it was unjust, but because those bound to it began to challenge its inevitability. What changes history is not suffering alone, but the rejection of suffering as normal. This rejection requires a shift in consciousness. The unbearable must be understood not as an individual burden, but as a shared condition. When people realize that their private pain is widely experienced, isolation breaks down. Shame loses its power. Anger, once suppressed or redirected inward, finds a social target. This collective recognition transforms discomfort into political energy. What was once endured silently becomes spoken openly, and what is spoken openly becomes contestable. Power responds aggressively to this shift. It seeks to restore acceptance through repression, distraction, or limited concessions. Small reforms are offered to preserve the larger structure, urging people to be patient, to trust gradual improvement. But patience is itself a political demand, one placed almost exclusively on the oppressed. Those who benefit from the existing order rarely counsel restraint upon themselves. The demand for patience functions as a mechanism to delay transformation until momentum is lost. The unbearable is also managed through fear. People are warned that challenging the system will make things worse, that instability is more dangerous than exploitation, that resistance threatens survival itself. This fear is effective only as long as people believe their current condition is tolerable. When daily life already feels like a struggle for survival, fear loses its grip. At that point, the risks of change begin to appear no greater than the risks of remaining as things are. Social transformation begins in these moments of refusal, when people withdraw their consent, not just emotionally but materially, when workers strike, when communities organize, when individuals stop internalizing blame and start assigning responsibility. Endurance gives way to action. These acts do not emerge from abstract ideals but from concrete experience. They are responses to conditions that have crossed the threshold from difficult to intolerable. The unbearable, once rejected, exposes the fragility of power. Systems that present themselves as permanent reveal their dependence on compliance. Rules that seemed unquestionable are suddenly questioned. hierarchies that appeared natural are recognized as constructed. This recognition spreads unevenly, contested at every step, but each instance of refusal weakens the assumption that things must remain as they are. Transformation does not begin with perfect clarity or unified vision. It begins with a simple but radical decision that life should be more than survival under imposed conditions. From that decision flows organization, struggle, and the reimagining of social relations. When the unbearable is no longer accepted, endurance ceases to be a virtue, obedience loses its moral cover, and the demand for a different way of living starts to take shape in actions that disrupt the routines of domination and challenge the idea that suffering is the price of existence. The truth now stands exposed. What you were told was normal was never natural. What you were told was freedom was carefully managed submission, and what you were told was personal failure was collective exploitation. The system survives only as long as its victims accept its logic, internalize its judgments, and endure its violence in silence. But history does not move forward through obedience. It moves when those who carry society on their backs recognize their own strength and refuse to live as instruments of another's profit. You feel the strain because the system is strained. You feel the contradiction because you live inside one. The same force that exhausts you also depends on you. Every machine, every institution, every profit, every luxury rests on labor that can be withdrawn, reorganized, and reclaimed. Power fears nothing more than workers who understand this, who see themselves not as isolated survivors, but as a class capable of shaping history. Let this be the moment when endurance gives way to resistance, when resignation gives way to organization, when suffering gives way to struggle. Do not ask for dignity from a system that requires your dispossession. Take it through unity. Do not wait for justice from institutions built to deny it. Create it through collective action. The unbearable is not your weakness. It is the signal that the old order can no longer contain the lives it exploits. Rise with clarity. Organize with purpose. Act with solidarity. The world that exhausts you was made by human hands, and it can be remade by them.